This panel at the 6th Annual Media Reform Conference, good grief, who will cover LA news now? We're going to be talking about trying to answer those questions, whether it will be the Kochs or Murdoch, or I believe Eli Brown and Austin Butner have floated an idea to run the paper as a foundation, as a public trust, like The Guardian of the UK. It's a very good model. I'm not sure about those two characters. The Guardian, of course, used to be jokingly referred to as the Groundy ad because it had so many typos in it. It was originally the Manchester Guardian. And it's in a context of British media where you do have full spectrum politics as opposed to the kind of homogenized centrist politics that we have here in the United States, which are reflected in our newspapers, which may have a lot to do with the fact that the newspaper owners recognize that half of their customers are Democrats and half of their customers are Republicans. And in order to not offend anybody, I think they may well have come up with this kind of binary convention in American media of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, meaning the pro argument, the con argument, and then a meaningless mush, turning our journalists into eunuchs who are incapable or unable to have passion and conviction. And this has led to the global warming being denied. It gives legs to the global warming deniers because after all that is just the equal and opposite argument. I mean, the reductio absurdum of that argument, of course, would be that every time you have a Holocaust survivor on, you have to have a Holocaust denier on. And creationism has been equated with evolution, and as though in the universe of discourse there are only two black and white ideas. But in terms of the ownership of newspapers, of course, we've had our share of venal oligarchs like Colonel McCormick. We've also had some enlightened families like the third generation of the Chandlers. And, but essentially the corporations are taking over, and of course they act in the corporate interest, not in the public interest. An example of how the corporate interest differs from the public interest, corporate speech being more important than free speech, would be the 60 Minutes, which is the storied CBS program that probably is the last vestiges of investigative journalism, since they still have a budget. They're the great, one of the more important stories of all time was the tobacco story that became the basis of the movie The Insider. That was spiked by CBS owners who at the time had a big stake in Lorelei Tobacco. So there you have an example of why corporations have a different vector on what speech is as opposed to the rest of us mere citizens. And in many ways, the fact that we have any kind of free media or freedom of speech in the media, I think is largely an accident. It's been predicated. We don't have a kind of BBC to set a standard, as most of the European countries have. We've been lucky with people like Bill Paley and some of the people that started CBS. And I think the owners of the television in particular, if they had their way, they would have wall-to-wall commercials, because commercials are advertising means revenue, that means profits. Content is an expense. So if Michael Copps and everybody went away, I think that's what we'd end up with, wall-to-wall commercials. And an example of how we've lost content in television, of course, is when the OJ trial happened, the television owners realized that this was a boon. You don't have to spend money on content. You could just have trials, and that's led, of course, to reality television. The other possibility, of course, is bringing back the fairness doctrine. I actually had a real hands-on experience with the fairness doctrine years ago. Haskell Wexler and I made a documentary for a group of renegade admirals, generals, and CIA officers in Washington who were afraid that the world was going to blow up at the end of the Carter administration, when the Committee on the Present Danger, run by Paul Wolfowitz, with unlimited funds from the military-industrial complex, were pushing a scare film called The Price of Peace and Freedom. And we made an alternative to that called War Without Winners. So every time The Price of Peace and Freedom played on American television, they had to play our film, which got us an enormous audience, which we otherwise wouldn't have had. And I think that's an example of how that system of the fairness doctrine moderated speech. And Richard Viguerie, in fact, one of the right-wing, early right-wing organizers, said the repeal of the fairness doctrine has led to the right-wing domination of American politics. And he may well be right. And just to touch on somebody mentioned Congressman George Brown of Riverside. Riverside, of course, and the Inland Empire used to be held by Democratic Congresspeople, but since the fairness doctrine went away and Limbaugh and Fox News emerged, they hit the ground running. They were ready for it. The fact that people in Riverside and the Inland Empire have to drive at least 2 hours a day, making them captive audiences of Rush Limbaugh, has turned the politics of the Inland Empire far to the right, and every congressperson out there is a Republican, and indeed most of them are under investigation from the FBI. So the last stand, of course, is net neutrality. It's been mentioned before, the total corporatization of information. At the end of the year, the DC Appeals Court will be taking up this case, whether or not the rules governing net neutrality, which are holding on to the idea that we still have an electronic commons. If you have any optimism, then you're delusional, because the DC Appeals Court has 4 vacant seats because of filibusters. The Democrats haven't been able to fill them. They're extremely far right-wing, and that looks like the ruling is going to go against all of us, or all of we the people, who own the airwaves, which we license out to the Murdochs and the Kochs. So it's up to us to assert our ownership of what we already own. Let me turn to Bob Scheer. He will talk for about 10 minutes, and then Kathleen will talk for about 10 minutes plus, and then we will have our third speaker, Angelo, for 10 minutes, and then we will have a brief discussion amongst ourselves and an extensive Q&A from you, our learned audience. Bob? Well, actually, let me read your bio, Bob. No, but they need to hear it. No, they need to hear it.
I don't know. It's, we're going to run out of time. And no, I don't. Yeah, well, obviously I'm going to talk. I'm the only one here who knows anything about the LA Times. And I feel like I'm talking about, I don't know what, my mother or mistress or, father, what have you. I have a long relationship with the paper. I was there for 30 years, 29 years. My wife was a vice president, associate at Narda Zucchino, started as a copy messenger. And I love the paper. I live about 4 blocks away from it. I look at it every night. I have a lot of friends there. And I know its warts. I know its great strengths. When I went to work for the LA Times, it had enormous power, as you well know, in California, the entire West. We didn't get the New York Times for 2 days. It arrived slow mail. The LA Times was the paper. And in fact, one of the mistakes they made is if they had run more of the New York Times, they didn't want to, the New York Times would have been delayed probably 5 more years from coming out west. But the LA Times was the only game in town west of, Manhattan, really, certainly of Chicago, and it could set the agenda. It helped get Nixon to be president, and it also turned around a lot of other things. And I just don't want to get too involved with the good old days. The good old days sucked, but they also were good. They were contradictory. And not just in the old days when the John Birch Society had some influence at the paper, but even up to the 90s when Bill Clinton was in the heyday of print, when even was in many ways still stronger than broadcast. Broadcast was still driven by what the print organizations were doing, the New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune. Even then, I think of the 90s, I was covering some of the stuff you were talking about before. I covered the Telecom Act. I covered welfare reform. I covered the Financial Services Modernization Act, the reverse of Glass-Steagall, and I covered the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. And in all those 4 instances, game-changing legislation for this country, the most profound changes since the New Deal, really, the mass media, the old print media sucked. It played a cheerleading role for the worst of it, a cheerleading role. On telecom, I remembered vividly, the big media outlets were merging, were getting together. They wanted this. They didn't care about poor people, so they cheered on welfare reform, particularly because it was packaged by a Democrat, Bill Clinton, charming and so forth. And it destroyed the only federal poverty program of any significance. We just ended the federal obligation to poor people, and you didn't even know it. Reading the New York Times, the LA Times, and so forth. That was certainly true of the Telecom Act, where there was no serious discussion. On the Financial Services Modernization Act, I've written a whole book about it. The Great American Stick-Up, how Reagan Republicans and Clinton Democrats enriched Wall Street and destroyed Main Street, and the record is very clear. You look at the front page of the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Wall Street Journal, or you look at the editorial page, the word modernization. Modernization was a great thing. We have to compete in the world, and to do that, we have to get rid of these onerous regulations, and we have to allow the merger of private investment banks and commercial federally insured banks. And it wasn't just Lawrence Summers and Rubin. It was the New York Times editorial and the LA Times editorial cheering them on. Modernization, modernization, modernization. And it opened the floodgates to the greed merchants and almost destroyed the whole economy. And we're still suffering from it, and we live in a time when it doesn't get reported because we've had the kind of concentration of media that was described, that was made possible in part by the telecom, and in which poor people and the systems that were supposed to be in place to help poor people aren't working. The only one that is working is food stamps because agriculture likes that. But basically, it's hard to get on welfare, it's hard to stay on, and we don't have the kind of safety net. And we've left it to the tender mercies of the states, and so people are hurting really big time in states that don't have any kind of liberal, progressive presence. Compare Texas to California, you could see the picture very clearly. So I think, one, the old media was always a mixed bag. When it was good, it was quite by accident, generally of family. In the case of the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, definitely family. Whether it was the Sulzbergers or the Chandlers or the Grahams, and we know that. And we know because Kay Graham decided to take the message of her husband after he committed suicide and try to make it better, and she stood for something, and she had the balls to do it. The case in the New York Times, the Sulzbergers and the Oaks decided to be a classier actor. That was good for the long run. And it happened in the case of the LA Times. First, the decision during wartime not to cut the news back to nothing and just focus on ads because they were going to emerge after the war as the classier paper, which they did. And then the great Otis Chandler, and I will sing his praises. He's the guy who hired me. That's enough of an achievement for, trust me. He took a lot of heat from his mother and anybody else who had access to him. I wasn't the only one, but Otis Chandler made, and this will relate to what I want to conclude on, Otis Chandler made a decision based on the market. And this is a positive point to be made here, as everybody has this doom and gloom about who's going to take over the LA Times. Otis Chandler was a good fellow, but basically he was saying, hey, we're out of joint with this community. This is not John Birch, LA anymore. And we better get with it. We better try to figure out. Remember in the Watts riot, they didn't know where Watts was, and they didn't have a single black reporter. They had to get a guy from advertising to figure out what, this is before having Google and everything, where the hell is that neighborhood? And they didn't have any women, so they didn't know about the doggone shield and all that. I mean, this was all a legend already when he came in. He said, we better get some women, some black people, a lot of brown people, make it a little better. They weren't that successful, but they recognized they live in a very different community. So I have 2 points to make to anybody who wants to buy the bloody paper, including your group here, that might get the $31 billion together. A, print is over. It's over. And the ability of these print organizations to move into the internet and make money, lots of luck. I should mention, my publisher is here, is Wade Kaufman from Truthdig. I am the editor. We had 1 million people come to us in 2 days, 2 weeks ago when we ran the Thomas Young thing. We have great big bold servers. We reach the whole world. We can't make money. We don't pay ourselves. And why? Because Google and all these other people suck off all the advertising revenue, and that hits the Wall Street Journal, hits the New York Times. And the effort to build walls, paywalls, so forth, doesn't really work yet. We don't have a business model, and so what you're doing is the old print is kind of still grabbing the few heirs that they can get to support the journalism. So the real issue is, how do you support journalism? But it won't be by cutting down trees. It won't be by the traditional, and we can cry in our soup, but it's over, okay? It is going to be on the internet, and it's going to be in different forms. I happen to find it very exciting. I tell people I started out as alternative media with Ramparts, and I ended up with Truthdig, which is Ramparts on speed. I love it. We reach people in Shanghai. We reach them in Dublin. We're having a ball. And when the people I can't reach, I also appear on Huffington Post, The Nation, blah, blah, blah. You know, you can appear. We, by the way, our publishers, Wade, decided with the Thomas Young letter, the tragically wounded Iraq war veteran. It went around the world. Not only did we have millions of people coming within a, 24-hour period, but she did it jointly with 150 publications around the world, and I could track where we had 200-300 million people read this guy, and Thomas Young was able to define, not the opening of the Bush Library, Thomas Young's piece was able to define what the Bush legacy was, what the Iraq war was. So it was an incredible achievement. People who are bemoaning the state of it, you should look to positive examples like that. Whistleblowers get their day. We can even broadcast this guy's great work. You know, we have Chris Hedges, who was the New York Times bureau chief, got pushed out by the New York Times. After all, Chris Hedges, the best journalist operating in the world today. Well, he writes for Truthdig. We're very proud of it. So I do want to end on one note here. Whatever group buys the LA Times, which will be a sick puppy no matter what they do, okay? And I went through this. My wife was the editor of the LA Times in Orange County and the great battle with the Orange County Register. I know all about that, pumping money, fighting. But at the end of the day, your paper no longer has the power to define that community. For one reason, they don't have a monopoly on information. They can't tell you that stealing the water from Northern California and bringing it to the valley is going to be great for the people who live downtown. They can't do that anymore because there'll be whistleblowers and people on the internet that say they're lying, they don't, blah, 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 and here are the facts. So whoever buys that paper, they're not going to be able to change the culture here. They're going to have to be pro-immigrant or they're going to be dust. You cannot put out the LA Times without embracing immigrants, period. End of story. I don't, oh, okay. You can't put out the LA Times without embracing the gay community. It's out of the closet. It's too productive. It's too well connected. It's too important economically. It's not going to happen. I could go down the list. You can't suddenly go to war all over the place. People are tired of war. You got 1 minute. You will have to be sensitive to poor people because we saw in the last election in California that basically this population wants to help people. And that even the wealthy people in California, Marin County, and the Silicon Valley voted to tax themselves more because they know they need public schools. They know that they have to do something to level. This ain't Texas, okay? So anybody takes over the LA Times, they're going to have to operate within those market realities, or it'll disappear. It'll blow away. And something else will take its place for the people who still want something to hold in the morning. So I wouldn't sit around and lose too much sleep about the Koch brothers coming in, or is it Eli Broad, or is it this one, or let's have a savior. We don't need them. They won't do that much damage. And if they don't respond to the community, they're going to be wiped out.
Thank you, Bob. And obviously in the Q&A, we will deal with some of the alternatives about whether the running it as a foundation, as a public trust works, etc. And although I tend to agree with Bob, but I do like to read that newspaper with my coffee. And I like the feel of touching the residue of dead trees. So let's turn now to Kathleen Miles as Associate Editor for HuffPost LA. She earned her BA from UC Berkeley, where she studied political economy and non-industrialized studies. She has worked in labor, education, and politics as political action coordinator for the Iron Workers International. During the 2004 presidential election, district representative for the U.S. Congressman, she was district representative for U.S. Congressman Adam Schiff. She was field investigator for the U.S. National Labor Relations Board and Teach for America middle school teacher in South Central, while simultaneously getting her MA in education from Loyola Marymount, a busy person. Before coming to the Huffington Post, she worked for the Pat Morrison program at KPCC, the NPR affiliate in Southern California. And Kathleen will be talking about the need for local media. Welcome to our panel, and here's the mic.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. At the Los Angeles Times in-house awards ceremony last week, columnist Steve Lopez addressed the entire staff and said, he addressed the elephant in the room. He said, raise your hand if you would quit if the coalition that consists of, we believe, Austin Buettner and Eli Broad and maybe Ron Burkle bought the paper. Nobody raised their hands. Nobody would quit. Then he said, raise your hand if you would quit if Rupert Murdoch bought the paper. A few of the staff raised their hand. Then he said, raise your hand if you would quit if the Koch brothers bought our paper. And about half the room raised their hand. So I'm presenting a little bit more of a pessimistic view, but that's kind of what my nature as a reporter. I'm skeptical not only of the Koch brothers, but also of what some have kind of characterized as the white knight group, the Eli Broad, Austin Buettner, possibly Ron Burkle, and a couple others as the local option. So, you know, if the boogeymen now are the Koch brothers, the original boogeyman was Sam Zell, who bought the paper in 2007 and quickly became the devil incarnate for his slashing of the staff and his general vulgar personality. But I gotta, you know, talk about a silver lining that I think has occurred in the last 4 years of bankruptcy at the Times, and that has been status quo. That has been Sam Zell not inserting his influence in the editorial content. He's stayed out of the editorial board's business. He's let the reporters do their thing. There hasn't been propaganda reporting, and you know, there's no off-limits topics for the reporters, as far as my friends at the Times tell me. So I think that, you know, we might need to consider that might change under new ownership, even if it's the good group, the good guys, we could call them the BBB triumvirate, the locals. You know, we know it certainly wouldn't be the case under the Koch brothers. The New York Times reported that 3 years ago at a conference in Aspen, Colorado, the Koch brothers said the media is part of their 3 pillars for the next 10 years as far as their political strategy goes. So we can expect that they'll take over the editorial board if they become the owners, and that'll probably also trickle into the news. But I also think that having local ownership under Buettner and Broad, we also need to watch out for such an influence. So the general positive side of local ownership is there's several parts of it. One is that they're supposedly lovers of the city. They're here, they care about the city, they know the city, as opposed to Sam Zell, as opposed to the Koch brothers. They're vulnerable because they're accessible and they're here and they can't run away and they have local reputations to uphold. This all sounds great. And you could also sort of say it would bring back the family feel that we had under the founding Chandlers that were local and that were sort of real players, real LA guys. But the problem is that there's a dark side to local ownership, as we saw with the first 60 years of the Chandler family. They used the Times for their own interests. They used it to promote business development. We saw that in 2011 with Doug Manchester, who bought the San Diego Union Tribune. He used the paper for propaganda, real estate development, and support. So Buettner, Broad, and Burkle, those names are in the LA Times all the time, and they have their hands all over the city. They are involved, they have political interests in LA, they have business and philanthropic investments, and they have friends everywhere, important friends. So it'd be hard to report on something that doesn't brush against one of their interests. And it'd be hard to imagine that this wouldn't influence the editorial content of the paper. For example, back in 2005, the Times ran a series of hard-hitting pieces on then Getty CEO Barry Munitz. Barry had abused his expense account, and part of the story portrayed him with Eli Broad taking lavish international vacations together, including on Broad's yacht. Now, if Broad had been owner at the time, would he have let those series run that were slamming his buddy Munitz? It's a good question. Perhaps he would have let it run, even though the story led to Munitz resigning. Perhaps he would have let it run for the sake of the paper, you know, the reputation of the paper. Maybe he would have let it run because he has so many friends that he can't protect Munitz because it would piss off his other friends who wanted Munitz out. Either way, Broad isn't afraid of getting his way. He'll piss people off along the way, and even though he's such a great philanthropist, you know, he's a notorious meddler, and I wouldn't put it past him to do what he wants. Similarly, you know, without direct interference on any owner, you know, saying you can't run this story or you need to run this story, the consciousness is there. It's in the newsroom. It's in the knowledge of every reporter in the back of their head when they're writing. So it's a question about all those issues that those three men care about in the city. You know, would reporters have the guts to report stories that go against their philosophy or that even shed that individual in a negative light? The one silver lining, I think, well, there's many, but the one that is important to talk about is that there's several of them. It's a coalition. It's a oligarchy, if you will, not a monarchy. And so hopefully that would provide checks and balances, even though they all lean politically to the left. You know, whether it's the Koch brothers or Ashton from the Orange County Register or the several other people that have been talked about as possible owners. The question is how much the Times reporters would be able to stand up to the owner's personal opinions. So, you know, let's say that the Koch brothers own the paper and a Times reporter works on a piece. She goes home that night and it never hits the press, it disappears. Would one of those reporters have the guts to make that public? If she did, she'd probably get fired and maybe hopefully get written about in the New York Times, and then that would put pressure on the LA Times ownership to be more objective. But you know, it's not as simple as that. It's not usually one big blowout. It's 1,000 small cuts, and I don't think that many Times reporters want to lose their jobs. A lot of them, they're mothers or fathers, or they're young people pursuing their career in a town where there's no other options for newspaper journalists. And especially if half the staff quit under Koch ownership, that's half as many people that are going to be likely to stand up to their owners. The brave ones, the ones that stand their ground, are probably going to be the ones that leave. Not to mention that would be such a huge loss of talented journalists who have years of relationships and knowledge of the city. So either way, regardless of who our owner is going to be, we need to be watching carefully because there's going to be change. You know, the LA Times, even though there are other truth diggers out there, the LA Times does decide largely what the LA news is. Having worked at KPCC and listening to the radio every day, you know, the segment A on some of the biggest shows, Air Talk or Which Way LA, is often a story that was on the front page of the Times that day. So if the agenda at the Times changes, the agenda at other news outlets is at risk of changing if we're not watching carefully. And I think what we specifically need to watch for is not the conservative biased stories, the propaganda reporting that could perceivably happen. It's the stories that aren't reported, the bias that we see in stories that disappear, that stop getting coverage. And those are harder to spot. For example, Fox News not reporting the gun control debate. You know, last week when President Obama started to give a pretty moving speech about chastising Congress for not passing background checks, he got not even a sentence into that speech when Fox News cut to a panel that we're going to discuss the liberal media bias. So Fox is sort of figuring, okay, silence on gun control will protect the status quo, and you know, things will stay the way that it is. And so that silence, that that lack of coverage is really what we have to be listening for in the future in LA. So as LA journalists, either at the Times or not at the Times, I think the first thing we need to do is research the friends and interests of whoever the next owners are. And then we need to watch. And if the Times don't report, or only, if they give special treatment to those friends and interests, then other reporters need to fill that gap and report on the stories that are no longer being reported. And so that means we need to be preemptive and entrepreneurial, not just reactive. We need to report on what's broken and ignored. And we need to go beyond just going to city council meetings or going to LA County supervisor meetings. When you go to meetings or you read press releases or you get statements on the record emailed to you, or you talk straight to face-to-face with the sheriff's department, you get lies or you get what they want you to hear. You have to do the kind of dogged reporting, the requested public records, to really find out what's going on behind those meetings. But what was the conversation that happened, in the parking lot before the supervisors sat down in front of an audience? We have to continue to hold politicians accountable and follow up with promises and things that they said six months ago, a year ago. I think, it was already mentioned the story today on the front page about the super PACs in the LA mayoral race and how that's not what LA voters voted for several years ago as far as campaign finance goes. That's a perfect example of the LA Times, really calling out politicians and legislation that's not being followed through. Another thing that we really need to watch out for, I think, is following up once the excitement's died down. For example, on the cop killer, Chris Dorner, that was sort of the perfect several-day Batman-like adventure story for LA reporters. It's what a lot of reporters live for. But what we really need to live for is that follow-up and really use that as an opportunity to look at how the police handled that situation. And, did they shoot to kill or did they handle it with the right funds and attitude? We need to look at racial discrimination cases within the LAPD, not just present exciting crime stories of the day that are entertainment, but really do reporting that is maybe less sexy, but is helpful to the community in the long run. Her perfect example of that was the Bell scandal that the LA Times broke. No blogger would have thought that you're going to get a hot story out of the city of Bell. But the LA Times did, the dirty work. They had an entire room at the LA Times filled with papers that they had, documents that they had requested. And it not only got the Pulitzer, it got the Pulitzer Gold Award for public service because of the impact it had in the community. It resulted in legislation requiring politicians to post, city politicians to post their pay online and their staff to post their pay online. It made the whole nation of journalists and citizens look with their city governments with more scrutiny. And that's really the kind of reporting that we need to do. We need to be asking the questions that will benefit the community and not just be entertainment of the day. And I have a whole lot more, but I'm going to pass it along and we'll come back to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen Miles. Now we're going to hear from Angelo Carasone, who is the Vice President of Media Matters for America. Prior to that, he organized the successful Stop Beck effort, a social media campaign to alert advertisers about what their products are being associated with in terms of Glenn Beck. More recently, he helped organize a similar campaign against Rush Limbaugh, which has resulted in a $100 million loss in 2012 for Limbaugh's program.
Thanks. So for me, the talk about the LA Times consolidation is actually, it's an example of the kinds of things that we're going to see more of going forward. And I think in order to really understand what the potential implications are, I think it's worth looking at. And for me, I can't divorce it from sort of the lay of the land. because so far we've heard a fair amount about consolidation. And that's true. There's a lot of consolidation taking place in the media, which itself presents very serious problems. But there's a flip side to that as well, because there's consolidation at the top, but there's actually fragmentation at the bottom. And that's why you see dwindling audiences of local news, of network news, of cable news, major broadcast news, print. The audiences are fragmenting. It's not that they're tuning out entirely. They're not disengaging entirely. They're just consuming and getting their information from different sources. And sometimes they're owned by the same consolidated companies or are connected in some ways. But that audience fragmentation is worth considering in light of what's taking place at the LA Times, because sort of the work that we do at Media Matters is we identify, in large part, most of our resources are spent to identifying examples of misinformation or sometimes the absence of information which supports a specific agenda, and trying to identify the food chain, where that information started, how it sort of worked its way up from a potentially well-funded and well-placed source or sort of a random source, and how it got from what would not be considered a news agency or any sort of process to the television screen or the front page of your newspaper. How does it work through that food chain? Because there's a very deliberate process there, and sometimes there's some predictability to it. And in large part, we try to quarantine it to the more conservative circles, and so we cede a lot of ground, but we try to quarantine it from spilling over to, say, the larger, what would be considered the mainstream or some of the more reputable or outlets. And I think what Mr. Copps was talking about before, he kept talking about the media as an ecosystem, and it really is. And the process in this food chain that takes place in which examples of misinformation can work themselves up from a tweet or something that has been deliberately put out there by a well-funded source and get sort of validated and washed and sort of sanitized into legitimate news nuggets is a real concern in light of what the potential risks here of a takeover by the LA Times. And that's sort of what I really want to sort of dig into a little bit. And before I sort of talk about the LA Times specifically and what the potential implications are there, I just have to digress a little bit to get into some of the economics of journalism, especially today's journalism, because in today's journalism, and I certainly agree, print is dying. It is dying. The actual print is dying, but those brands are still very powerful and meaningful. So while their print publication might not be as potent or important, that banner, what they are, New York Times, LA Times, makes a difference. It makes a difference as to whether or not you're a secondary broadcaster, whether or not you're a smaller outlet, or whether or not you're an influencer with a big audience feels comfortable talking about that specific topic or not. If it wasn't in the LA Times, well, maybe it's not big enough, or I saw it in all these other sources, but they're not exactly reputable, so I'm not going to touch on it yet. So that brand really does make a difference. And so, and in today's environment, economic environment, clicks equal page views. And so to that end, what we sort of see is, and that's where some of the food chain stuff becomes somewhat predictable, that you have instances of information or misinformation, or there's a lean towards things being hyper-sensationalized or covering the trite and the trivial over, say, the more substantive, because that's the stuff that gets clicks. And that's not by any means a justification. But from the perspective of a journalist or a reporter who works at an outlet, who has to both produce content that goes in print as well as, say, online content, just to give some ballpark numbers, if you're a reporter making roughly $60,000 a year, you've got to make somewhere between, if this is the sole calculus, you would need to get about 2 million page views, maybe give or take a little bit, in order to cover your cost a month. 2 million page views a month. And that means that you could write the absolute best article that you spent months digging into, and it doesn't come even close to covering what you need to cover. So you have to sometimes dig into the sensational or the trite to get those clicks to cover that balance. I mean, that is an economic reality of the environment that we live in. And that obviously places real pressures on reporters as to the decisions that they make. And I think that lay of the land, at least from my perspective, is where the risks become of the LA Times potentially being taken over here, especially by some of these outlets, are a real problem. So it also means that sometimes good reporting gets crowded out because you're not going to cover it. But there's very effective ways to game the system, right? And we saw this most recently with CNN, right? I mean, one of the reasons why they were front and center out there reporting sources, and it was a dark-skinned male who has been, has been put in custody, is because they felt that they had enough to get there, and they wanted to get there first because those clicks and that content was page views, and that's real dollars. And while their brand may have suffered a little bit and they got made fun of fairly well, they made a lot of money as a result of that, because they were first on the beat. They're the ones that had the article up there first. They're the ones that got the exclusive. They're the ones that got credited there. And that makes, it's sort of an economic reality that we're in. And so we're just thinking about that specific landscape and the fact that information can travel up from unknown sources or non-reputable sources to reputable sources and then become actual parts of the conversation and then part of people's consciousness and how they actually make decisions, because it's gotten that far along the process. For me, thinking about the LA Times being sold and what that means, and I keep saying the LA Times, but there are a lot of other papers there too. There's 2 in Florida, there's 1 in Baltimore, and there's a lot at stake here. In places that that need local news too. So we'll keep it focused on the LA Times, but there's much more at stake in that particular takeover, all with their own brands and reputations that people trust or have some degree of a trust relationship with. And so in the instance of the Kochs, they're not really news people. And I think some of what I feel has already been said, that I don't, even if they were to take it over, this sort of dramatic overnight change there, I think they do have to be responsive to the local community. They are business people. They're not stupid in that sense. But there's no doubt that there would be real concerns and risks of them in terms of who they put in charge, who's making those decisions, where they get certain examples of information from, what kinds of things they choose to validate and legitimize. And the Kochs are very smart about this. They've already recognized the real power of taking advantage of an existing hollowed-out media. So one thing that the Kochs have been very heavily investing in terms of the media is something called the Franklin Center, which is a group that goes out there. They cover state houses. That's all they do. It is an organization that just goes to state houses and covers state houses. Why? Because lots of papers, as newsrooms consistently shrink and they lose reporters, they're not having people on that beat anymore. And so getting some Koch-funded material that you can easily put into your paper or your outlet it's good for that paper, at least ostensibly, and it's great for the Kochs because it's their sort of position or perspective being sanitized and branded through a local source that you trust. And that's a real concern, at least for me, that they, one, recognize the value that's already there and the potential for advancing their agenda, and now they wouldn't need to go through these intermediaries in the event that they were to, say, own one of these papers. I don't think that they'd be in the back room every day, but who they put in charge, just like what they did with the Franklin Center, putting in charge some of their most senior and trusted executives from their other institutions, is clearly going to be a factor that's there. In terms of Murdoch, why I say thinking about the LA Times as an example of the larger lay of the land is, regardless of whether or not he is a player in this situation, his new publishing company, when he sort of spun it off last summer, which was born of scandal to begin with. It was born of sort of a dereliction of responsibilities and a culture of corruption that has pervaded the very top layers of News Corp. But aside from that, the one thing that he told the directors when he was beginning to form this company is that this would be a growth company, that it would not be, he always fancies himself a newspaper person, and at least that's how he tries to identify himself, but he made it very clear that when this company spun off, in part, I think, to make it more palatable to his investors and stakeholders, that this would be a growth company, that when it formed, that they would immediately start beginning with acquisitions, and that they would put in place somewhat of a new culture there, that the gravy train was over because they didn't really have that buffer of some of their television media to cover up for the losses of some of their papers, like the Post, for example. And where that becomes a concern is that, one, that's already a stated objective, and two, this new spin-off that he has identified, which was originally supposed to start with about $1.9 billion, he injected very recently an additional $1 billion in there. That's a lot of money to buy up already struggling resources and papers. And sort of just to sort of put a bow on all of this, if you think about the economics of journalism today and what that means, and you think about these brands as validators, as already trusted sources that people rely on and have relationships with, the idea that some entities, or especially hyper-commercial ones, could go in there and change a culture and use these already reputable and trusted sources to advance very specifically. I don't think they'd go out there and advance these very large, either anti-agreement or anti-gay agendas unless there's some compelling reason for them to do it. But the idea that they would do it to say, not talk about the next examples of telecom of legislation or to advance for consolidation is a real concern. And these are the realities that when I think about this, I think this is just one of many, and there's a larger playing field at stake here. So that's all.
So how are we going to do the Q&A? Does people have to line up at the microphone? Yeah, while they're getting it ready.
I think we could have maybe 1 minute to go back. I think we have a difference of, is this working? A difference of perspective. The sense I get also maybe in the room is that somehow there are good guys and bad guys. And the Koch brothers are the bad guys, and they're going to get, in the hen house here, and it's all going to be disastrous. And my view is it just isn't that way. Most of the problems that we face now were created by good guys. And I go back to my own journalistic career. For God's sake, I was the editor of Ramparts magazine because the New York Times supported the war in Vietnam. And they didn't support Cesar Chavez and what he was doing with the farm workers. And they were insensitive to the civil rights movement. When Martin Luther King came out against the war in Vietnam, the New York Times editorial condemned him for dividing the civil rights movement. These were not saints. When I was fired from the LA Times, it's wonderful Burkle is the guy who hired the publisher who fired me. What am I supposed to do, cheer? That he may take over the LA Times? The woman who was in charge of PR for Enron for 7 years before they went kaput now works for Eli Broad, one of his things. So, who are we talking about here? The issues that I mentioned before, the good guys and maybe even people in this room were on the wrong side. They were on the wrong side of the Robert Rubins and the Lawrence Summers and the people who destroyed our economy and said, trust Wall Street. They were on the wrong side of the people who said welfare reform makes a real. When I was covering those stories, it was the so-called, the people I liked to have dinner with, who were the guys drafting the legislation. I even know Barney Frank. I just saw a video of him. He's a great fellow. I've loved him. But I remember going into his office and asking him, why are they reversing Glass-Steagall? And hearing about how complicated it was, and talk to my aide, and then the aide telling me it's so complicated, you got to talk to Charlie over there. Well, Charlie's a bloody lobbyist. Yeah, but he understands it. And those people here who've covered Washington know it. They know how that works. And money talks. A.J. Liebing, the great media critic for the New Yorker, once wrote, freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one. Okay? And that is the reality. I hate to be the one neo-Marxist in the crowd here, but the fact of the matter is we have a society in which greed is dominant. Multinational corporations are reordering the world economy. They're sacrificing American workers. They don't care about the American population. They don't really even care about the nation state anymore. So you got GE with 2 out of 3 jobs abroad. They don't pay taxes, but yet Obama appoints Immel to be the head of his jobs council. Okay, so I think, we just got to put this. Now, I want to say one last word just to provoke a little discussion here. The libertarians are not my enemy. If the Koch brothers will really challenge, I think, by the way, going after some politicians at Bell is kind of a chicken shit story, frankly. I'm glad they did it. There shouldn't be corruption, but going after Chase and Goldman Sachs and the Federal Reserve is a little tougher, and they haven't done that for a long time. But I do want to say something about ideological conformity. I remember when Arianna Huffington was the right wing on left, right, and center, okay? And yet, I think she's done more. I'm a very big defender of Huffington Post. For all of its failings, I think Arianna Huffington, I was one of those people who thought, oh my God, the internet is going to be, yes, it can be killed. It can be shut down. It can, all terrible things. But if anybody had told me back then that the Huffington Post would replace the Drudge Report as the most important thing, because otherwise we would have been sitting here talking about Drudge is taking over, like the Koch brothers, okay? Now, the fact of the matter is Huffington Post is probably the most important new media force. I don't know if you guys would agree. And well, anyway, she's certainly on the progressive side of things. It certainly, I think, opens up the area, raises a lot of questions, people. So I just want to challenge the kind of woe is me thing. I think there's a lot of possibility with the internet. There's a lot of good stuff happening. And I think we're in better shape now than we were 15, 20 years ago. I think this is a good new day for journalists, and we just have to figure out how to fund it. That's all.
We get that. That's obvious. But there's bad and there's badder. There's people who have, you know, civic interests when they want to buy the paper, that they care about journalistic standards. And yes, they have opinions. Even reporters, even though they're supposed to be objective, we have opinions. But then there's people like the Koch brothers who simply just want to push their political agenda. There's a big difference. And, you know, that's why I think that, you know, as reporters and as readers and as citizens, we have to watch very carefully for that agenda. I just don't think that you know, that they're all the same. I don't know if you want to.
So I agree with some of the sentiment that the idea that we try to portray or bundle every potential negative criticism into just a couple examples is that would be just reductionistic. It's a little too simplistic. And I think that's partly why I tried to delve into some of the economics of the journalism there, because regardless if it's a Koch's or some large faceless commercial entity that was putting those pressures on people, the reality would be the same. The lack of investment in the types of journalism that is valuable to society, and the push towards the kinds of, say, using those brands to sanitize misinformation or allowing things to just trickle up organically through the sort of food chain process is an issue. And just to give an example of that, I mean, before we had what's considered to be modern press today, you know, recognize that the press started out as a party press. It was a product of political parties. And then after that, it was yellow journalism, which was the fact that there was no such thing as a newspaper subscription. And so you had to have paper boys out on the streets selling things, which is why you had the most sensational headline. It wasn't until we had a subscription-based model, which is what I think what we're getting at here, is that we figured out how to fund journalism. And that's when a profession and ethics and professional responsibility started to emerge. And I think that we're in a similar transition period right now. We're at a return to a point where sensationalism is what sells. That's actually what's commercialized and monetized. That's what works its way up the food chain. And I think that whoever is the steward, we just hope that they're a little more sensitive to those realities and willing to sacrifice some of their commercial in order to consistently maintain that profession while we figure out and develop alternative means of funding this sort of important work.